The image is grainy, flickering with the static of a high-altitude transmission. In the sickly green hue of a night vision feed, shadows move with a lethal, practiced grace. A door is breached, not with an explosion, but with a silent, mechanical efficiency. Then the frame settles on a single figure. He is disoriented, his hands forced behind his back, the sharp zip of heavy-duty plastic ties cutting through the humid Caracas air. Before he can utter a word of protest, he is hoisted into the belly of a matte black stealth transport. The rotors hum a low, predatory tune as the aircraft vanishes into the darkness over the Caribbean. Within hours, the world wakes up to a different reality. The scrolling banners on every news network, from New York to London, scream the same impossible headline: Nicolas Maduro captured. Anchors, breathless and stunned, report on a daring surgical covert operation that bypassed layers of presidential security in a matter of minutes. In Washington, there is an air of unbridled euphoria. The sense that a decade-long deadlock, marked by sanctions, famine, and a massive exodus, has been shattered in a single night. The unsolvable problem of Venezuela has finally been fixed. The West celebrates what it believes is the dawn of a new democratic era for South America. But as the sun rises over a leaderless Caracas, the silence isn't one of peace. It is the silence of a fuse that has just been lit. To understand why this night changed everything, we have to look at the real-world paper trail that made it possible. This wasn't just a random act of aggression. It was the ultimate execution of a legal strategy, years in the making. In March 2020, the U.S. Department of Justice did something unprecedented. They unsealed a series of narco-terrorism indictments against the highest levels of the Venezuelan government. At the top of that list was Nicolas Maduro. The U.S. didn't just want him out of power. They wanted him in a courtroom. They slapped a $15 million bounty on his head, a digital wanted poster broadcast to the entire world. The allegations were staggering: a conspiracy to use cocaine as a weapon to flood the United States, orchestrated by the Cartel of the Suns, a group of high-ranking military officers who had allegedly turned the state into a criminal enterprise. In our reality, this created a bizarre geopolitical stalemate. To some, Maduro remains a legitimate head of state, protected by sovereign immunity. To the U.S. and dozens of its allies, he is a criminal fugitive hiding in plain sight. His presidency delegitimized after the disputed 2018 elections. This legal status turned Venezuela into a pariah state, but it also created a dangerous assumption. The world believed that if that bounty were ever collected, if the head of the snake were removed, the rest of the regime would simply wither away, leaving a vacuum for democracy to fill. The prevailing logic in Washington was simple: remove the centerpiece and the house of cards collapses. They believed that the extraction of one man would be the surgical strike that ended a decade of misery. They were convinced that the success of the mission would be the end of the story. They were wrong. In this timeline, the collection of that $15 million bounty didn't buy freedom. It bought a front row seat to an international catastrophe. In this alternate timeline, the extraction occurs during a week of peak regional tension. Border skirmishes with Colombia are at an all-time high, and the Caribbean is thick with rival naval exercises. The catalyst is a calculated moment of vulnerability. A massive, nationwide power outage plunges Caracas into a tomb-like silence, turning the bustling capital into a labyrinth of shadows. Under the cover of this artificial night, a team of elite private military contractors, lured by the $15 million bounty and guided by the silent hand of state-level intelligence, descends upon the Miraflores Palace. They don't come with the thunder of an invading army, but with the chilling precision of a scalpel. Using high-altitude jumps and sophisticated jamming equipment that cripples local communications, they ghost past the outer security tiers. The blackout raid is over before the city's backup generators can even kick in. There are no grand speeches, no heroic last stands, just the muffled sound of breaching charges and the sight of a dazed Nicolas Maduro being zip-tied and hustled into a stealth transport. But as the transport disappears into the pre-dawn mist, the operation reveals its fatal flaw. The success is too clean. The strike was so narrow and so focused that it left the Venezuelan military, the FAM, completely untouched. From the powerful generals in the Ministry of Defense to the thousands of soldiers in the border outposts, the entire apparatus of the state remains fully armed and combat ready. They haven't been defeated in battle. They've been bypassed and humiliated on their own bow. In Washington, the architects of the raid believe they've successfully decapitated a regime. In reality, they've just kicked a hornet's nest without a plan for the swarm that is about to follow. The head is gone, but the body of the revolution is still standing, and it is looking for someone to blame. By mid-morning, the news has paralyzed the globe. In Washington, the rhetoric is one of unblemished triumph. Official spokespeople stand at podiums framed by flags declaring a victory for international law and a new dawn for the hemisphere. They speak of the $15 million bounty as a debt finally paid, framing the extraction as a surgical removal of a cancer. The narrative is clear. The dictator is gone, the liberation has begun, and the transition to democracy is inevitable. But as the sun rises over Caracas, the reality on the ground is starkly different. The streets do not erupt in a carnival of celebration. There are no crowds toppling statues or waving flags in the plazas. Instead, there is a chilling, heavy silence. The Venezuelan people, hardened by years of systemic collapse, do not see a liberation. They see a terrifying power vacuum. They know that when a centerpiece is ripped out of a complex machine, the remaining gears don't just stop. They grind everything in their path to dust. Behind the closed doors of the Fuerte Tiuna military base, the atmosphere is far from defeated. It is electric with panic and predatory instinct. This is the moment where the Cartel of the Suns, the shadow network of high-ranking generals and officials deeply embedded in the nation's illicit economies, realizes they have reached the point of no return. For these men, Maduro's capture isn't just a political shift, it is an existential threat. They are men with indictments hanging over their heads in the same courts where Maduro is currently being processed. They realize that if they allow a peaceful transition to a pro-Western government, they aren't just losing their jobs, they are losing their lives, their fortunes, and their freedom. The dream of a success baseline begins to fracture. The military command doesn't fracture into pro-democracy factions as the West had hoped. Instead, they consolidate in a desperate cornered animal defense. Without a clear succession plan or a civilian leader with the backbone to command the generals, the chain of authority snaps. The mission was designed to end a regime, but it has instead stripped away the only person who kept the internal rivalries of the military in check. The shift is instantaneous. The crisis is no longer about who will lead the country. It is a brutal scramble for survival among the remaining elite. As the cartel of the suns realizes they have nothing left to lose, they stop acting like a government and start acting like a cornered insurgency. The surgical strike hasn't ended the war. It has just removed the only person who could have negotiated a surrender. The machinery of the state is still fully fueled, fully armed, and now it is completely unhinged. The architects of the extraction believed they had decapitated the beast. They didn't realize the beast had already scripted its own funeral. In the windowless bunkers of Sabine, Venezuela's feared intelligence service, a silent countdown reaches 0. This is the dead hand protocol, a fail-safe Maduro signed into law months ago, designed to incinerate the region if he was ever removed by force. The retaliation isn't kinetic, it's digital. Within hours of the capture, encrypted servers across the continent begin dumping terabytes of classified data onto the open web. These aren't just government secrets. They are dossiers of betrayal, detailed records of bribery involving high-ranking Colombian generals, video evidence of illicit deals between Venezuelan oil officials and Brazilian lawmakers, the names and locations of deep-cover assets embedded in the security apparatuses of every neighboring capital. The payoff is instantaneous and catastrophic for regional stability. As the dossiers go viral, the trust that held the anti-Maduro coalition together evaporates in a single afternoon. In Bogota, Brasilia, and Quito, the headlines shift from the fall of a dictator to the corruption of their own leaders. Riots break out, not in support of the extraction, but in fury against the exposed politicians. The very neighbors the U.S. relied on for logistical and moral support are suddenly paralyzed by internal scandals and mass protests. The surgical strike was supposed to bring the region together. Instead, Maduro's parting gift has set every neighboring house on fire, leaving Washington standing alone in a sea of exploding alliances. The dead hand has reached out from the transport plane and choked the diplomatic life out of the continent. While the capitals of South America burn with the fallout of the leaked dossiers, the ideological heart of the Caribbean ignites. In Havana, the rhetoric is no longer about diplomacy or sanctions. It is about the survival. Within hours of the news, the Cuban government declares the capture of Maduro a flagrant act of international piracy and a declaration of war against all sovereign Latin nations. Nicaragua follows suit, placing its entire military on high alert and shuttering its borders to any Western-aligned commerce. This isn't just political grandstanding. The Bolivarian dream was built on a network of mutual defense, and the extraction has triggered a regional immune response that Washington never fully accounted for. The Caribbean, once a playground for international trade and tourism, transforms overnight into a no-go zone. Small, fast-attack boats and paramilitary militias, trained for years in asymmetric warfare, begin a series of provocative maneuvers. Intelligence reports flood into the Pentagon with red alerts, unidentified radar signatures stalking commercial shipping lanes, and low-altitude drones buzzing regional airfields. These aren't the actions of a conventional army looking for a fight. They are the movements of a hornet's nest that has been kicked. Every island and coastline from the Gulf of Mexico to the mouth of the Orinoco becomes a potential launch point for a mosquito fleet designed to harass and bleed the U.S. Navy's logistics. Inside the Situation Room, the mood shifts from congratulatory to a cold sinking realization. The planners had studied Operation Just Cause, the 1989 invasion of Panama. They expected a swift decapitation, a brief period of confusion, and a grateful populace. But this isn't Panama. This isn't 1989. They haven't just removed a dictator. They have destabilized a continent and radicalized an entire ideological bloc. The surgical strike has inadvertently created a regional wildfire that is jumping borders faster than it can be contained. The U.S. is no longer managing a transition in Caracas. It is staring down the barrel of a multinational insurgency that sees the capture as the first shot in a war for the soul of the Americas. The simple solution has just become the most complex nightmare of the century. As the Caribbean becomes a militarized theater of shadows, the world waits for the other shoe to drop. And it comes not from the region, but from the global powers watching from the wings. While the Caribbean waters churn with local militias, the truly heavy shadows are cast from thousands of miles away. In Moscow and Beijing, the capture of Nicolas Maduro isn't viewed as a victory for international law, but as a violent breach of the global order and a direct threat to their massive investments. The retaliation begins not with bullets, but with balance sheets. Venezuela owes China and Russia tens of billions of dollars in loans, all backed by the promise of future oil. With the man who signed those contracts now in a high-security transport, the creditors go cold. Beijing and Moscow instantly freeze all debt negotiations, effectively paralyzing the Venezuelan financial system. But the pain doesn't stop at the border. Beijing announces an immediate suspension of key agricultural and mineral imports from across South America, citing unstable security conditions. It is an economic chokehold designed to turn the region's own leaders against the American operation. Then the steel arrives. The Kremlin announces a series of unscheduled naval exercises in the Western Hemisphere. Within 48 hours, satellite imagery confirms a Russian guided missile cruiser and a nuclear-powered submarine are transitioning the Atlantic, cutting a wake directly toward the Caribbean. They don't have to fire a single shot to change the math. Their presence turns a regional extraction into a global standoff. The Monroe Doctrine, the 200-year-old policy that the Americas are off limits to foreign powers, is being challenged in real time. Washington is no longer just managing a political transition in Caracas. They are staring down a renewed Cold War in their own backyard. The surgical strike was supposed to isolate a dictator, but instead it has invited the world's most powerful rivals to the table, and they aren't leaving until the price is paid in blood or gold. As the global powers lock horns, the vacuum left behind in Caracas begins to fill with a much more intimate and much more violent chaos. While the world's superpowers move their pieces on the global map, the streets of Caracas descend into a visceral, localized hell. The colectivos, the motorcycle-riding, state-sponsored civilian militias, have been waiting for this exact moment. Within hours of the capture, they emerge from the barrios in a coordinated surge. They don't see a liberated nation. They see a decapitated revolution. To these groups, this is not a legal extradition. It is a Yankee kidnapping of a sovereign head of state. They flood the airwaves with calls for total resistance, seizing key intersections and government buildings, turning the capital into a patchwork of fortified fiefdoms. Any hope for a velvet revolution or a peaceful transition vanishes in a cloud of black smoke and burning tires. But the true nightmare is the fragmentation of the military itself. The Venezuelan National Guard and the Army were held together by a delicate web of patronage that has now snapped. Without a central figure to balance the various interests of the generals, the command structure shatters. Hardline factions, fearing they are next on the American extradition list, dig in for a final stand, while opportunistic officers move their armored units toward the Miraflores Palace to claim the empty throne for themselves. By nightfall, the sound of heavy machine gun fire echoes through the valley of Caracas. It is no longer civil unrest. It is a multifactional urban war. Pro-government militias clash with regular army units, and rival military wings turn their weapons on each other in a desperate scramble for power. The surgical strike has successfully removed a dictator, but it has replaced him with 1,000 local warlords. And as the city burns, the loyalist remnants of the old regime realize that if they cannot hold the capital, they can still cripple the world that took their leader. While the streets of Caracas bleed, a far more devastating blow is being struck hundreds of miles away in the Orinoco Belt. Deep within the command centers of PDVSA, the state-run oil giant, Maduro's most fanatical loyalists, the technocrats and engineers who owed their fortunes to the revolution, initiate a contingency they have rehearsed for years, Operation Scorched Earth. They do not simply turn off the valves. They destroy the means of production. In a coordinated wave of sabotage, massive refineries are set ablaze, critical pumping stations are rigged with explosives, and the digital architecture governing the pipelines is wiped clean. Plumes of thick, acrid black smoke rise over the Venezuelan horizon, visible from low Earth orbit. The world's largest proven oil reserves, the lifeblood of the nation, are effectively rendered useless in a single afternoon. The global reaction is instantaneous and panicked. With Venezuela's heavy crude wiped off the market and the Caribbean shipping lanes now a de facto war zone, the price of Brent crude doesn't just climb, it teleports. Within 48 hours, oil prices shatter historical records, hitting levels that make the 1970s energy crisis look like a minor market correction. In the West, the initial euphoria over Maduro's capture turns into a bitter, tangible poison. Stock markets go into a localized free fall as the cost of everything from jet fuel to plastic surges. Transportation networks grind to a halt, leading to empty grocery shelves and a sudden, sharp economic depression. The simple solution of a surgical strike has triggered a global cardiac arrest. The cost of removing one man is now being paid at every gas pump and every checkout line on the planet. But as the global economy staggers, The human cost inside South America is about to escalate from a tragedy into a catastrophe. As the smoke from the Orinoco Belt blankets the sky, a different kind of movement begins on the ground, one that no amount of border security can contain. In the wake of the urban warfare and the total collapse of the national economy, the steady trickle of Venezuelans fleeing their homeland turns into a literal tsunami of human desperation. This isn't just a migration. It's a panicked, headlong flight from a country that has effectively ceased to function. Within weeks, the numbers swell into the millions. Entire families, carrying nothing but what they can fit in a backpack, clog the highways leading to the frontier. In Colombia, the border cities of Cúcuta and Maicao are the first to buckle. The sheer volume of arrivals overwhelms every humanitarian agency on the planet. Tent cities stretch for miles, visible from space, as the Colombian government realizes with horror that its infrastructure is melting under the weight of the crisis. To the south, the Brazilian state of Roraima is similarly engulfed. The Amazonian roads become a river of people, creating a logistical nightmare that the Brazilian military is ill-equipped to handle. But the crisis isn't just logistical, it's political. In Bogota and Brasilia, the initial support for Maduro's removal curdles into fury. The surgical strike orchestrated by silent state actors has dumped a generational catastrophe onto their doorsteps. Internal stability in these neighboring nations begins to fracture. Food prices in Colombia skyrocket as supply chains break. Social services in Brazil's northern regions collapse entirely, leading to violent clashes between locals and the desperate newcomers. The removal of one man has not liberated a continent, it has set it on fire. The backfire of the extraction has turned innocent bystanders across South America into collateral damage in a war they never asked for. The region isn't just watching a neighbor fall, they are being pulled into the abyss with it. And as the borders dissolve, the world looks toward the architects of the operation, demanding a solution that doesn't exist. The surgical strike that was supposed to last 45 minutes has now lasted months, and the scalpel has been replaced by a sledgehammer. In Washington, the halls of power are filled with a chilling realization. They haven't just removed a dictator, they've dismantled a nation's containment system. What was promised as a clean, high-tech extraction has devolved into what analysts are already calling a Caribbean Vietnam. The U.S. military, initially celebrating a flawless tactical win, now finds itself trapped in a strategic nightmare where every move forward only pulls them deeper into the mud. The dilemma is paralyzing. To stabilize the catastrophic collapse of the global oil supply and stop the refugee tsunami from permanently destabilizing the entire Western Hemisphere, the light footprint approach is no longer an option. The Pentagon is forced to present the White House with the unthinkable, a full-scale ground intervention. We are no longer talking about a dozen SEALs in the night. We are talking about tens of thousands of troops, armored divisions, and a multi-year occupation to restore order, a plan that was never meant to be on the table. Back in the United States, the mood has shifted from jubilation to a toxic blend of confusion and anger. The initial mission accomplished headlines have been replaced by grainy footage of American helicopters hovering over a burning Caracas, not as liberators, but as targets for hidden snipers. Public opinion, once buoyed by the thrill of a successful bounty hunt, has flipped overnight. The average citizen, feeling the sting of record-high gas prices and seeing the mounting cost of a new war in their own backyard, is asking a single haunting question. Why are we there? The easy win has become a quagmire, and the exit strategy is nowhere to be found as the first flag-draped coffins begin the journey home. But the coffins aren't just coming from the cities, they are coming from the jungles, the mountains, and the very skies that the U.S. once thought it owned. As the American presence expands, Venezuela transforms into a magnet for every anti-Western force on the planet. This is no longer a localized civil struggle. It has evolved into a global proxy war, fought on the doorstep of the United States. Across the border, international brigades begin to form. They aren't official state armaments, but volunteers. Veterans from Eastern Europe, specialized advisors from the Middle East, and ideological hardliners from across Latin America, who see Caracas as the new front line against Yankee imperialism. These are privateers and mercenaries funded by dark money and fueled by a narrative of resistance. They bring with them decades of experience in urban sabotage and jungle warfare, turning every barrio into a fortress and every forest trail into a death trap. The technological landscape of the conflict shifts overnight. The U.S. military's greatest advantage, air superiority, is neutralized not by a rival air force, but by a flood of high-tech asymmetric weaponry. The black market is suddenly awash with man-portable air defense systems and sophisticated FPV drones. Every shipping container arriving in the region is a potential Trojan horse, hiding the components for cheap, lethal, loitering munitions. For the American pilot in a $20 million helicopter, the danger is no longer a radar-guided missile from a known battery. It is a teenager with a handheld tube hidden in a rooftop garden or a hobbyist drone rigged with an anti-tank grenade flying through an open window. The airspace over northern South America becomes a lethal no-go zone. Reconnaissance flights are swarmed and supply lines are choked. The success of the extraction has successfully birthed a multi-year insurgency that the U.S. is fundamentally unprepared to fight. The conflict has moved past the stage of political transition. It is no longer about who sits in the Miraflores Palace or the legalities of a bounty. It has become a war of attrition, designed by foreign architects to bleed the American treasury and exhaust the American will. The surgical strike has left a wound that won't close, and as the months turn into a year, the liberation of Venezuela is forgotten, replaced by the grim reality of a permanent high-tech insurgency that has only just begun to show its true devastating face. 1 year has passed since the night the lights went out in Caracas. Nicolas Maduro remains confined within the sterile walls of a high-security facility, a ghost in a jumpsuit. But his physical absence has created a presence that is far more terrifying. He is no longer a failing autocrat struggling with hyperinflation. He has been transformed into a global icon of resistance. His kidnapping has become the ultimate rallying cry for an anti-Western front, uniting disparate regimes from across the globe in a shared narrative of imperialist overreach. In the eyes of his supporters and the undecided alike, he is a living martyr, and his silence from a prison cell speaks louder than his speeches ever did. From a balcony, on the ground, the map of Venezuela has dissolved into a nightmare of fractured sovereignty. The dream of a smooth democratic transition has evaporated, replaced by the grim reality of a failed state. The country is now a patchwork of fiefdoms, ruled by past lords and splintered remnants of the cartel of the suns. These factions, once held together by the patronage of the Miraflores Palace, now fight each other for control of the remaining spoils. The Amazon basin has regressed into a prehistoric lawlessness, a dark theater where illegal mining, human trafficking, and insurgent bases thrive beneath the canopy, shielded from the eyes of a distracted world. The geopolitical consequences are even more profound. For nearly 2 centuries, the Monroe Doctrine dictated that the Western Hemisphere was the exclusive sphere of influence for the United States. Today, that doctrine is effectively dead. By choosing the path of direct extraction, Washington signaled to its neighbors that no border is sacrosanct and no leader is safe. The result is a continent in retreat from its northern neighbor. Traditional allies, terrified by the precedent of a surgical strike that disemboweled a nation, have begun to seek security guarantees elsewhere. The Caribbean, once an American lake, is now a playground for rival powers who have moved in to fill the vacuum left by a United States bogged down in its own backyard. The easy fix, the $15 million solution that promised to end a crisis with a single zip tie, has instead triggered a generational catastrophe. The world has come to a devastating realization. The extraction wasn't a masterstroke of international law. It was the moment the trap was sprung. By removing the head of the state without a plan for the body, the West didn't kill the beast. It created a hydra. The stability that was once criticized as tyranny has been replaced by a void of chaos that threatens to pull the entire hemisphere into the abyss. The surgical strike didn't save Venezuela. It destroyed the very foundation of regional order, proving that some solutions are far more dangerous than the problems they were meant to solve. But as we pull back from this vision of a fractured hemisphere, we must look at the world as it actually exists today. In our reality, the $15 million bounty on Nicolas Maduro remains uncollected. The stealth transports haven't launched, and the Miraflores Palace remains under the control of the incumbent government. This isn't due to a lack of tactical capability, but rather a calculated adherence to a doctrine known as strategic patience. While the rhetoric from Washington and its allies is often fiery, their actions are governed by a cold, hard logic. The devil, you know, is almost always preferable to the void of the unknown. Historically, the United States and the international community have learned painful lessons from the direct extraction of heads of state. From the power vacuums that followed the fall of regimes in Iraq and Libya, history has proven that removing a central figurehead without a pre-existing, robust, and locally accepted alternative is a recipe for a multi-decade disaster. In our world, the U.S. Department of Justice uses indictments and bounties not as a literal shopping list for mercenaries, but as a tool of diplomatic leverage and international isolation. It is a slow, grinding process of lawfare designed to squeeze a regime's finances and restrict its movement rather than a trigger for a cinematic kidnapping. The international community understands a fundamental truth that our dark timeline ignored. A bad government, no matter how repressive or economically disastrous, provides a predictable framework of control. It maintains a monopoly on violence, manages borders, and, most importantly, provides a single point of contact for negotiation. To remove that pillar is to invite 1,000 smaller fires that no single superpower can extinguish. In reality, the goal of international pressure isn't just the removal of a leader, but the preservation of the state itself. Diplomacy is slow, frustrating, and often feels like an exercise in futility, but it exists to prevent the very dead hand scenarios and regional firestorms we've just witnessed. The reason this daring operation hasn't happened in our timeline isn't because it's impossible. It's because the cost of success is simply too high for the world to pay. Real-world stability is a fragile architecture built on the understanding that sometimes the only thing worse than a tyrant is the chaos that rushes in to fill his seat. Look at the map of this alternate South America one last time. It is a tapestry of fractured states, lawless jungles, and scorched oil fields. It is a continent where the Monroe Doctrine didn't just fail. It ignited a fire that consumed the very interest it was meant to protect. Now, look back at our world. The map is intact. The borders are still defined. The regional powers are not currently locked in a proxy war that threatens to go global. While the situation in Venezuela remains a humanitarian tragedy and a political stalemate, it is a controlled crisis. We often find ourselves frustrated by the slow, agonizing pace of international relations, demanding that someone just do something. But, as we have seen in this dark timeline, doing something can be the most dangerous move on the board. We can be thankful that in our reality, the impulse for a cinematic victory has been tempered by the harsh lessons of history. Diplomacy is a grinding, unglamorous process, but it is the thin line that keeps the dead hand from ever being triggered. The next time you hear a politician or a pundit call for a simple solution to a complex geopolitical crisis, remember this exercise. Remember the night the trap was sprung, because in the world of high-stakes power, the shortest path to a resolution is often the fastest way to burn everything to the ground.